Hi there. So I just wanted to say that week two's discussion posts were really great. Thank you so much for sharing more about your content areas and helping each other. The part about musical lessons with guitars was interesting. And I really appreciate that you guys all stuck to the theme pretty well. I didn't respond to you directly because I find that when the instructor responds in the thread that the other people that might respond back are discouraged from doing so. But if you do have a question specifically that you would particularly like me to address in your posting, please feel free to actually, put in parentheses or something that you really do want an answer to something, because sometimes I can't tell. So thank you, and especially thank you for those that went back. So the originator of the post, if you went back after your classmate had left you feedback, that you went back and looked at it. I do appreciate it when we have an attempt to actually have a discussion and a discussion board. I think that's going to be even more important this week's, because this week's discussion requires that you use the information you learn in today's presentation and then apply it in our discussion board. And this is a skill that's going to be really important as we move forward in the course, because objectives are going to be involved in almost every project that we have going forward. You will need to be able to write objectives and write them correctly. And we'll be discussing, of course, what in the world correctly means for this course, but it's going to be a very important skill for you to have. And as you go forward, it'll be more apparent why it's open to interpretation and why there's actually something to discuss. All right. So also as a reminder, we wanted to remind everyone, if you haven't already, please do sign up for a group teaching group. We're using Qualtrics to just sign up. So if you enter the form and there is no 2 weeks to choose from, there's only 1 week to choose from, that means the first week is already booked. So we're going to be having 2 groups of 3. So just please get your, please sign up for a week. If you don't sign up, then you're automatically going to be in whatever group that's left, and that's maybe not as wonderful as you might want for planning purposes. I'm going to be discussing the group teaching in a separate posting on Thursday when the groups are actually formed, and I can open forums for groups. So we're going to be talking about objectives and a lot about Bloom, if you're familiar with him. We're going to be talking very vaguely about the test plan development project. It's going to have its own post, but in Blackboard, the projects tab should now be visible to you. And the first project there that's listed there will be TPD, which is test plan development, which is a 3-part project. You can take a look at your syllabus, but in general, you're turning in 3 drafts for this particular project, and then you'll be submitting 1 final project. So we're just breaking them up into chunks, and you'll notice in the schedule that's kind of like back-to-back-to-back drafts. That's because it's been broken up into very small, manageable chunks that coincide with the weeks that we are learning about the information. So it's going to be, I think, pretty manageable. I've not had students have problems with accomplishing it in the past because it is broken up into pretty finite chunks. And so we can discuss it more at the very end. All right. Reminder, of course, please do not forget about the research goal. You do need to do hours, and it is due July 29th, and that may seem far away until you keep thinking it seems far away up until July 28th. So don't fall into that trap. I might as well get it done. And if you don't have any great travel plans or anything for Memorial Day, you might want to just get it done over this sort of extended weekend. All right. sort of touched on this already. We're having 2 groups of 3. The actual presentations are weeks 5 and 6. I'm going to do a full post on this on Thursday, but in general, week 5 is the lower level items, so binary, matching, multiple choice at the knowledge level. And now we'll be discussing today what in the world this knowledge level is. And then also on June 13th, that's the week 6 group. Those are the higher order, multiple choice, completion, and essays stuff. So we're going to be discussing that in more depth on a separate post, but these are the 2 weeks, and in general, you'll be given, of course, you have your textbooks, and these are the pages that sort of correspond to those chunks of information, but I'll also be giving you more materials and then access to a whole bunch of stuff in your own separate private weeks, group project meeting areas, so that you can whittle down all the information, because more as an authentic learning presentation sort of idea, teachers, we generally have a plethora of information. Like, we don't start from scratch frequently, right? We inherit a whole bunch of information. We inherit a curriculum from someone, but whether it's quality or whether it includes all the elements we want to include, or just visually appealing, is another thing entirely. So I'm mimicking the same thing that I've had going into this. I had roughly 5, I think, different versions of this information. They were all different in their own unique way, and I had to assemble what I thought was a cohesive piece of a lesson. So you're going to be doing the same sort of thing too, and like I said, more on this on Thursday. All right, so of course today we are talking about measuring learning outcomes, and this is a very, very important topic, because when we think of assessment, we're generally thinking of, testing something. Well, what are we testing? We're testing generally an outcome. We have some purpose for testing, or else we're not really, we shouldn't really be giving a test if we don't have some sort of objective that we want to be reaching. So the idea then is that we taught students something, hopefully, right? And we have some sort of purpose for teaching them. We have an outcome in mind. And that's sort of where we get this measuring aspect of it. Well, we want to measure it then, right? How do I know that you learned it? I need to measure it to know that you learned something. Okay. The objective, you want students to be able to accomplish something at the end of the lesson. That's pretty generic across the board. Now, the interesting aspect of this that we'll be getting into later is that this doesn't imply any sort of item. I can have the same instructional objective and measure it many, many ways. And that's going to be more evident in this week's discussion board, where I'm asking you to pick a standard and write objectives for it in 2 different ways. So it's going to be interesting to see what you all come up with. I look forward to reading it. As you've sort of been preluded to already, students will be able to is something that frequently is sort of attached with objective writing, because that's exactly what we're trying to do. If we're measuring an outcome, students will be able to do something. Well, what is that something? Identifying that and knowing clearly what it is you want out of that class. So in general, that makes teaching a lot more clear for your students. When they know what they're supposed to be learning, it isn't then some sort of confusing, nebulous, I don't know what my instructor was really trying to teach me. She just opened this paragraph. She just read this paragraph and it has tangentially makes no sense. And I don't understand why this was on the exam. And we've had classes like that, right? Where what the point of a lecture, I couldn't discern what the point of the lecture was. It was all over the place. I couldn't tell what the objective was. And that's generally when an instructor doesn't have clear outcomes for a particular lesson. And so when you identify those for students in advance, it makes the whole learning process much easier. All right. This seems to have come out a little blurry, but in general, we're relating to some sort of intended outcome, not exactly the process for achieving them. So this is a common mistake I see students make when they're writing objectives, that you box yourself into only having an objective be accomplished via an essay or via multiple choice test or via some sort of project. But in general, an objective should be pretty broad. You should be able to do anything, test it anyway with an objective. Now, some things are going to be more of a project-oriented thing that's, higher level, in which case that's not the sort of objectives that we are attempting to write right now. We're just trying to get our, bread and butter, everyday sort of objectives on the table first. But we have something that's specific, like I have some sort of idea of what you're supposed to be doing, but I could have you accomplish it in different ways. And so we're going to have some examples pretty soon about how this would work. And this is something really specific to note, that this is all about the students. It's not about you right now. It is, sort of what you want your students to get out. So it is about you, and yet it's not. It's way more about what you want your students to be able to do. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're writing these, that it is very much so written to be a little broad. It doesn't have to be, confined to one thing that you are measuring. Okay, so now that we have that lovely primer out of the way, our objectives for today are to explain the use of these lovely standards, help you understand how you develop an objective, especially for the purposes of this course. So you'll find maybe that objectives are not written universally, and I think that's very common, is that you will find an objective generally, and as you start doing these, you'll start be able to recognize, what an objective looks like, but it may not contain all the elements of the ones that we are teaching you, because, we're teaching you the very formal way to write objectives, a very formulaic version about it. So just like when you're learning a foreign language and you learn the very proper way of doing it, it's not wrong, right? But in everyday practice, it might not be quite as formal as you are learning in this classroom. The idea then is that you can discern that, oh yeah, that's an objective, it's just missing this piece. So that's something that's really common I see in professional development or in shared materials, is that there'll be a piece, or there'll be two pieces of the formulaic version of an objective that we are teaching you here. But please keep in mind that this sort of transfers, and even though we're requiring you in 4430 to do a 3-part objective, the field doesn't always, they're not always so formal. All right, and then we're going to be evaluating the alignment of objectives with outcomes. And so we'll definitely be talking about that one in a second. All right, we talk about writing instructional objectives in behavioral terms because those are measurable. That's just the point of it, period. So we generally use different levels of cognitive learning outcomes. So this is Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's depth of knowledge. In this class, we're generally going to be using Bloom's taxonomy. The state of Florida, I've noticed, has moved to depth of knowledge, just for the sake of this course. And if I happen to say this later and I don't remember to do it, Depth of knowledge is generally abbreviated DOK. So if I happen to say that, and don't wonder where that acronym came from. Okay, but I have uploaded for your use in week 3 the Bloom's taxonomy words. And I have uploaded the depth of knowledge chart as well. For your test plan development project, you are welcome to use either. It doesn't matter to me. They are slightly different. We'll be talking about that later today, of how these sort of match up. They don't really match up so well. Spoiler, right? But it doesn't matter to me which you happen to use for your discussion board forum. Please do use Bloom. I'm pretty sure I outlined that pretty specifically on the discussion board to use Bloom. It's just so that we're all on the same page. Okay, so we have, some outcome in mind, and we have our instructional goals and objectives that kind of feed from the outcome that we have in mind. And then that relates then to our instruction and our assessment. And what you find is that instruction and assessment, as we learned, informative assessment can be a two-way street. And really, it should be a two-way street. But you're not going to know that you need to edit your instruction, of course, until you give an assessment, a really quick one perhaps, or you just maybe look at facial body language and see, oh, okay, I don't even need to give a formal assessment. I can see the confusion on their faces. All right, so we need to edit something right now or cover it more in depthly because Susie Q did not get it, and that's fine. That's normal. So you have then this sort of chain here where you go from outcome. I want them to be able to do this. Okay, my objective of today's lesson is this. My instruction is here. My assessment is here. And then that's a two-way street. Okay, in 4430, you have 3 elements that we are going to require you to have an objective. A condition, some measurable and observable behavior, which is generally a Bloom or DOK word. It's sort of a verb, if you will, and a criterion statement. The textbook author, Macmillan, he calls this a learning target, but this is the same idea, and really it doesn't matter what it's called. For the sake of this class, I'm calling it criterion statement because that's what the other instructors in 4430 call it as well. But the purpose of it is not going to change, right? The fact that we call it something else is kind of moot. Just know that when you're reading this week's readings, learning targets, that is exactly what he's talking about. All right, so we're going to be going through each of the sections because I know, this measurable, observable behaviors, the conditions of performance, and the criterion, that's maybe not giving away exactly what it is we're talking about. So we're going to move through each piece. All right, so let us start. When we have these outcomes, we have an end product at the end of the instruction, right? And you have some sort of activity to get to that outcome. All right, so here's our handy-dandy example. After we cover a unit on Newton's 3 laws of motion, students will be able to explain. Explain is our Bloom verb here. The laws with 100% accuracy. So this is a 3-part piece, and I'll go through it right now. So we have this criterion. Criterion's easiest. I'm going backwards, by the way. 100% accuracy. Criterion. Okay. The criteria is 100% accuracy. Check. We have a measurable outcome, which is explain, which generally means that there's going to be either a verbal or a written response. but it doesn't matter. They're going to be explaining it somehow. Okay, that's measurable and observable. Check. There's our verb. And then you have this beginning piece. After covering the unit on Newton's 3 laws of motion, this is your stating condition. So there's always some caveat to the learning, right? After given somehow, like you'll see some words like that. So, after a lesson on thermonuclear dynamics, I chose a word I didn't remember how to say. Your students will be able to do this. And that's perfectly acceptable. Or after, let's use given. Given a poem, students will be able to identify the elements of the poem. I'm not the kind of content area expert in these subjects, so please forgive me if sometimes my examples fall a little flat. But the idea here is that you have some primer that is driving the action, right? So students are going to have something. You're going to do something to them, give them something, and then you're going to ask them to use that information or to use that material object to do something. And then they have to do it with some measure of accuracy, which sort of helps you on the back end. And this is tied a little bit more to next week with grading. So if here it's 100% accuracy, but if it's 3 out of 4 or 80% accuracy, then then what an A is, right? The cutoff criterion for acceptable. You can move on with the class sort of standards. All right, so I am not reading this to you, but this is the idea with how activities can then be derived. So the activity here then is that you are doing something related to the objective, but not the activity is something that's tangentially related to the objective, but it's not like a one-to-one match. Like you wouldn't know that was the activity that was going to happen based on that objective. That being said, this is when I mentioned to you that, of course, objectives and activities are, they feed each other, right? So every objective can have multiple different learning activities, and you will find that to be frequently the case in your instructor manual, that you will have a unit on something. So you have a learning objective, maybe not so outlined for you, but it's there. And you'll have multiple activities to pick from that will help the students master that objective. And so what I'm trying to say is that there are always going to be more activities than there can be objectives. Okay, and this is just a simple test question to use an essay to explain, right, the laws of motion. All right, so here's another example. After learning Bloom's taxonomy, students will be able to write 4 objectives using Bloom's verbs with 100% accuracy. Well, that's actually kind of the idea behind our test plan development project. After you've learned these words and how they work, really, you're supposed to be able to write them and produce objectives with 100% accuracy. That would be great. But that's definitely one of the things that we are trying to accomplish. One way that we could see if you could do it is create lists of observable and unobservable behaviors, which is sort of a tricky topic. However, this particular week, we are discussing it in a forum instead. So, like I said, there are many activities that can measure an objective. All right. So here's a good question for you. If you can pause the video now and see if you can answer them. Did you get it right? So the idea here is that these are outcomes. I can identify, I can recall, I can list, I can write. These are all outcomes that apply. Read is kind of a tricky one, which is why it's underlined, because reading is generally something that's happening in the moment, right? So it can be a little tricky as an outcome. I can't really say with any certainty that you watched something. I can put you down in front of a video and play it for you, but I don't know that you really watched it. But I can test. I can measure recall. I can measure that you can identify something. I can measure that you listed something or wrote something. I can't tell that you listened, and I can't tell that you studied. Not really. So that is sort of the distinction. So we're going to do another set. This is activities. Now these are really tricky. So same idea. Pause it and see if you can get them right. All right, let's see how you did. All right, so these are activities. Studying is an activity. Watching is an activity. Reading is an activity. Listening is an activity. They're not observable outcomes, though. So that is where the sort of distinction starts being a big issue. All right, so now we are moving on. Tell me, if you can, which are observable learning outcomes? You ready? Almost everything. I can't tell, though, that you value something. That is not an observable learning outcome. Not really. There's no really good way for me to measure that you value a religion or an individual as a teacher, as a role model. I don't know. How do you measure value? That doesn't work very well. But you can illustrate something. You can recite it. You can list it. You can draw it. You can build it. And I will always have some sort of outcome, some sort of material good at the end of that presentation. But value? Value would not work here. Oh, geez. Sorry about that. That happened really far faster than I thought it would. So insofar as observable learning outcomes, describing and solving are the only ones really here. You can't understand it. I can't measure that you comprehend something. I can't measure that you know something. Now that one kind of tricks people up. I can't know that you know something unless I measure it through another aspect of things. So I can't tell that you know it unless I'm asking you to describe it, to explain it. And same thing with appreciate. I can't tell if you appreciate something. You could be writing me a whole big essay of BS, and I would have no idea if that was really true or not. That is part of this idea. And I think maybe knowing, it just came to me right now, that it might be easier to think about this in the mastery performance literature, if you're familiar with that. We generally, we want students to master something, and I can't know that you've mastered it generally because we're looking at your performance. So I would need to do a whole lot of different testing or involved projects to know that you really know something, and that's not an immediate outcome, right? I'm sort of getting at your understanding and your mastery and your application of something deeply through a more intense project that requires you to do a lot of things. And that's maybe how I'll figure out if you know something or you understand it or you comprehend it. But superficially, you could just parrot back to me something, and that would be indicating that you performance-wise, you can spit back something immediately to me, but does that mean you really know it? Right? I hope that maybe helped clear that up a little bit. the issue with no doesn't really go away with, but it's not immediately observable, and that's sort of where this distinction lies, that these things are immediately products, right? A description, an equation that's been solved, these are immediate products, but I can't really get at your appreciation of something. All right. So go ahead and pause and see if you can figure out which ones are which. All right, how did you do? So if you were paying attention to that last slide, comprehend and understand, we're back there. Those are not observable behaviors, but all the other ones are. Okay. So now to these stating conditions. We have some sort of specific factor associated with the performance, equipment, materials, time, place. So sort of covered this a little bit before. After attending a lecture, after covering a unit on given a case study, given a calculator, given a poem, you get the idea. But this is generally the front end of the objective that you're writing. All right. Given a typed list, given a calculator, just more examples. All right. Try and figure out what goes where. So if 1 is a foreign automobile, 2 a thermometer, 3 an electronic calculator, and 4 a computer with word processing software, which one goes where? Okay. The last bit we need to talk about is this, the criterion level. So I sort of preluded to this already. You generally have some sort of measurable thing that helps you with your grading, right? So this is directly relatable to how you're going to go about measuring it for whether students have mastered the objective or not. So you get a percentage. They're 100% correct. Well, that might not be always the most easiest thing to accomplish. Generally, anything above an 80% accuracy is generally pretty good. So you got it. Maybe you were 1-2 items off, but for the most part, you understood. So, 100% accuracy, unless it's a crucial element, 100% accuracy isn't too common, especially with the state standards. All right, so you can also put the actual number of items. So if you have a number of items, you can just convert it to a percent, or you could just tell me the number of items, like 4 out of 5. Okay, that works. It's the same idea. Or consecutive items in a list that are correct, or with essential features such as hypothesis statement, complete paragraphs, transition statements. You could just have a list of things. You can have, if you were having some sort of test that it was completed within a time limit, or that makes far more sense when you're talking about like oral tests. Like if you're doing a foreign language and you have an oral exam on something, that it happens within a certain time limit. That makes more sense generally. Sometimes in science that makes pretty good sense too, but you will know if that makes sense for your topic area. And like in social studies, it's not as common to have a prescribed time limit just because there's very little that requires such accuracy. Generally, it's something percentage-wise, or consecutive items correct can sometimes be correct, or correct, I'm sorry. Consecutive items correct can sometimes work in social studies, depending on the unit you're talking about. But this general idea is that you have some sort of degree of accuracy that are getting. Criterion level is how well, right? So that's just stating this another way. Here are some more examples. Like I said, it depends on what you are trying to get out of this for your students. All or 100 is not generally necessary, but realistically, what would you be able to move on in your course with students knowing? So if students decently know it, like a B or maybe a high level C, could you move on and they would still be able to understand the rest of the unit? That's sort of the back of the head idea you should have for figuring out this number. Okay, so you are welcome to try this exercise. We have some answers that fit in. I'm not going to read it to you, though. Okay. Keeping it simple is probably the best advice that we can really give, because there are a lot of objectives that you're going to be required to handle as an instructor, and you don't want a whole bunch of fancy, complicated objectives, because you generally have to represent the objectives on an exam or a test or the end of unit completion for your grade level. And it can be really helpful if you have these objectives and with percentage of accuracy that they should correspond to the test with. We're going to be talking more about that next week with blueprints, but in general, do try to keep it simple so that you can have the same objective, be able to measure multiple things. And another reason that comes in handy is that if you happen to find that the activity you chose to go with your objective doesn't work, instead of having to submit new objectives, which your school may require you to submit for a lesson plan, you can just change the activity and keep the objective, so you don't have to rewrite stuff, which is always nice when you can just reuse and repurpose what you already have. So just something to keep in mind. All right, so part 3, we have sort of talked about this measurable verb, that it has to be something that there has an action associated with it. And it's really important to consider what's going on here, in more so than memorizing the level that a word exists, because as you'll see soon, there are the same words for multiple levels within depth of knowledge and within Bloom. So the same describing or explaining behavior can measure multiple levels of Bloom, and so there's more than one correct answer. If you say, well, what does the verb explain? What level does it belong to? Well, it belongs to quite a few things, and it really has more to do with the amount of processes associated and the level of cognition involved in accomplishing the task, more so than it does the word itself. And that's something to keep in mind, because I've had students try to just memorize the lists, and that doesn't really end that well, because it's a list by definition. It's helpful, but it's not meant to be used that way. Okay, so we talk about this magic triangle. So we have those objectives, the activity, the assessment. That was what we started with sort of at the beginning of this whole lesson. And I say it's a magic triangle, and I bring up that term specifically because you see it in professional development sometimes. I don't know who decided that it was going to be called a magic triangle, but they will refer to it as such sometimes. So if you'll remember that between learning activities and assessments, learning activities and instruction even, you are having sort of a two-way street. So I don't need to read this, I don't think, to you. But in general, what you're trying to do is measured with some sort of action. And that's part of this triangle. Okay. So this is important to note. The form the evaluation takes should measure the student's accomplishment of the learning objectives. Like that is point of fact what we should be doing. And I think it's important to note again that it's whatever form the evaluation takes, meaning that your objective could result in multiple types of assessments. And that's generally the case, that you will have one objective and you'll measure it 3 or 4 different ways. So if the objective is to identify U.S. presidents, well, you might have quite a few U.S. presidents for students to identify. You might do a matching sort of exercise, but you didn't limit yourself to just one, right? You didn't just ask them to or assess them on one president. You assess them on many presidents to understand that they know all these different presidents, or that they can identify them. I think that's more important there, that they can identify the president that belongs to an accomplishment or something like that. Okay, so we have these 3 domains of learning. We are more interested in the cognitive. If you're interested in it, Macmillan does describe the affective and psychomotor sections as well. But we are firmly in the cognitive area for the parts of objective writing. All right, so we have this taxonomy, right? And it goes from remembering to creating. And this is the revised taxonomy. I think I have a slide on it in the future. But the idea here is that there was a shift. And some of the levels moved around, and all of them received a sort of doing aspect to them. They all became ing endings. And the general idea then is that creating sort of flip-flop with evaluating. And what actually ended up happening was that there was a lot of literature and a lot of feedback from the professional world saying that, hey, actually creating something from scratch is a heck of a lot more difficult than evaluating something. And so that's sort of what happened here, is that they redid this. So if you think about it, if you're cooking and you're trying to create a brand new recipe that no one else has ever seen, that's hard to do. You have to be able to remember conversions of measurements. You have to understand how recipe things work together. You have to be able to apply all that work. You have to analyze it as you go, probably. Does it visually look okay? Does it smell okay? Does it taste okay? And then you have to, have some criteria in mind that, that's too salty, or, I need to be able to respond to that. That's too salty in some way. So in the aspects of creating something, I have gone through all these levels. And that's something to keep in mind, and something where my previous students have had some issue with. You are, the level of Bloom's taxonomy that you're achieving is going to include everything below the level that you're at. So if I'm at the analyzing level, well, then my student is technically remembering, understanding, applying, and is now also at this task of analyzing. It may not be as readily apparent about how the applying is working into that analyzing, but there will be some sort of way to identify how that's working. So they're building on each other. So an understanding task, by definition, requires that the student remember something, right? To be able to achieve understanding, you have to remember something. To be able to apply something, you have to remember and understand something. All right, so this increases in difficulty as we go through it. I should have saved that, I guess. This is exactly what I was talking about. Evaluation became creating. Synthesis became creating, by the way. So things moved around a little bit. That was it in general about what moved around, and then otherwise things became ing endings. Comprehension became understanding, and knowledge became remembering, but it's, that's not a big shift. All right, so we have the, low to high sort of in understanding levels here, where you're recalling, explaining, applying, being able to deconstruct, evaluate, and then create something in general. All right. So I don't need to read this to you, but this can be helpful as a slide for understanding Bloom. Okay, so we're going through each of the levels right now. So you're going to see, this is not the full list. Please see the full list on your week 3 attachment area. This is the full Bloom verb list is quite long, and I didn't have room to write it for every single one here. But these are some of the most common ones that I see it remembering. Right? So that you have defining, listing, recalling, describing, matching, reciting, identifying, naming, selecting, stating, outlining, labeling. So this is very, very generic. This is one step, right? I remember it, and that's it. That I'm able to name it, that I'm able to identify it. And that's sort of more important here, that you're really only doing one thing. You're remembering or retrieving information you've already learned. Okay. At the understanding level, by necessity, you're also you're hitting in on remembering. You are doing more, right? You're explaining. Well, I can only explain what I remember. So sort of idea where this is building off of it. So this is sort of a 2-level process. So I'm able to go into the situation and remember the information and then understand it by doing inferring, paraphrasing, summarizing sort of thing. Okay. All right, so applying, same idea. You're using all this information that you had previously and putting it in a different scenario setting. So transferring, organizing, preparing, demonstrating is a very common one that's used. I don't see operate very often, but it could happen. Modifies is another very common one, where we're taking remembering, we're taking understanding, relying very heavily on understanding actually, and then we are using it somehow that's new. Okay. Analyzing, of course, builds off of applying, and you are using all this information that you have and conceptually, generally in your head or with the use of a tool like a Venn diagram, creating an analysis of some sort of task where you're asking for yet another level of understanding from this, or cognition rather, from the student. And the levels at applying and analyzing can be a little harder to discern, but just because of their base level, that applying is pretty easy to denote what's an applying task, because it's just using something that you haven't already been exposed to, or you are putting it into a different situation entirely, like Romeo and Juliet in the suburbs or something like that. Analyzing, though, is generally going far more back to the assignment in general in doing this comparing and contrasting stuff. And so it's hard to see how applying can sometimes fit in there. But you have to maybe be able to tangentially understand something that wasn't exactly explained to you, and be able to figure out how it works. And so that's how that's how applying might be fit under analyzing. All right. Right, so evaluating, this is getting into the higher forms for sure. Analyzing is also considered a higher form of Bloom's taxonomy. But in general, you are creating some sort of understanding for yourself, and sort of expressing that evaluation in some way. Generally, evaluation is done in written form, but it most certainly can be done orally too. I just happen to see it more frequently as a paper or something being written. And that is definitely not to say that you can't evaluate in other ways. We are going to be talking a whole week. Is it a whole week? No, I think it's half a week on performance-based assessment, where that's a different form of evaluating. But that's definitely where we will take this evaluating level. But I just want to make certain that everyone understands that evaluating doesn't have to necessarily mean that there's a performance associated with the Bloom level, which I think is pretty obvious based on these examples that we have here. Like if you're judging a paragraph, it's not exactly a performance, right? But you might be able to see why there's a performance aspect that you could attach to evaluating. All right, I hope that's clear. We'll be talking about it more when we get to performance-based assessment, but in general, at this point, we're not talking about performances in general. In fact, just as a side note, please do not use performances in your test plan development project. That will, please just save that for our performance-based assessment project. I think that's a good enough statement right there. All right, so creating. This is hard to do. It is hard to write creating level items. And I don't think I've said this very clearly, but the level of what that is creating for one grade level is going to be completely different for some other grade level. So if I ask a kindergartner to create something, I am not going to hold that at the same standard as I would a fifth grader. And I think that makes sense. Like as students develop what is considered the utmost highest level of their understanding comprehension increases. And that's fairly, easy to understand once it's pointed out. At least I believe it is. It's hard to do these creating things that aren't performances. So creating, let me go ahead and just say it right now. Please do not think that essays are creating. They are generally not creating. It's the common misconception that I run into with students that creating needs to be an essay. Well, no, essays generally at an evaluating level or applying or analyzing, right? You're not creating something new based off of an essay. You might create a poem. That is a different thing entirely, but whether you're actually hitting applying or you're hitting creating can sometimes be a little difficult to tell, which is why I think we're going to be practicing in the discussion board this week at what level you are really hitting on. So that should be an interesting discussion that will help you sort of tease out whether you're actually accomplishing something or if you're actually accomplishing the level you're trying to accomplish or not. Okay. So we talked about this earlier, that web depth of knowledge is also centered on this thinking process. It's not on the product so much as it is the process. And so the depth of knowledge breaks that out far more clearly than Bloom does. And I think also worthy of note, Florida is using depth of knowledge, even though the field, anyone who, you come and talk to them about Bloom and they'll know what you're talking about. So it's kind of a preference thing. The school I was at was a private school and they used Bloom. So that's where I'm more familiar. But web depth of knowledge, I've gotten more accustomed to it. So it's not like I won't be able to help you with it, because it's a very well thought out sort of knowledge level system. Okay, so we have these 4 levels, right? You have recall, skill, strategic thinking, and extended thinking. And they build off of each other again. And these lists that you have here, these words are not, completely mutually exclusive. This is far more about the process, again, than it is the word. So please do not think that you're going to be memorizing these words. There's no point. Please do not attempt to memorize these words. You will always, have a chart for a depth of knowledge thing, but to understand that there are processes involved. Level 1 is a one-step process. Level 2, two-step. 3, more, and 4, a lot more. So let's just go dive in. If you'll remember, arranging, right? That was a level 1 skill, but then I'm also then ordering. Oh, I just realized that that probably didn't capture the narration appropriately. All right, well, hopefully that wasn't too bad. Level 1 was just using the sort of the one-step idea. Level 2 then is building off of that. So you're going from arranging something in level 1 to ordering it as well. So arranging and ordering it. So there's 2 things involved there to get to the product. All right, so this is level 3. This is even further. You have a whole sort of reasoning plan and a sequence of steps. And I think the hallmark here is this, that there's more than one answer that's acceptable. So if I have a compare and contrast sort of thing going on, then I'm not expecting the exact same answer from every student. That would be unusual. You'll have many elements that are the same, but there's definitely more than one possible answer. Okay. 4, this is the creme de la creme sort of idea. You get here eventually. You might not get here till the end of the year or the end of a unit on some things, but the creating, the analyzing, critiquing sort of idea, it takes a lot of time to formulate something here. This idea that you are designing something, it involves a whole lot of processes and a whole lot of mental capacity to be able to do this information. And you have then, of course, multiple correct answers, multiple ways to think about the problem, and there's generally group work or quite a bit of a project involved in the creation of this extended thinking. So appropriately named, right? It is a much extended process here. All right, so this is pretty. Oh no, there's one more slide after that. After this, the test plan development project. The information is posted in your TPD projects section of the Blackboard website. In general, you'll be doing just like we're doing for discussion board. You're going to be going to CPALMs. You'll be going to and finding a standard. So first you have to click on a grade level, and then you scroll and find the subject matter standard you want, like a social studies or mathematics or music or whatever, what have you. And then you hit standards, and you'll see all the standards populate. So as part of this TPD draft 1, you just completely copy and paste that standard so we know what it is. And then you write objectives using the 3-part objective writing that classroom assessment is requiring from you. And we're asking that you be able to cover 3 levels of Bloom or depth of knowledge, depending on what you're doing, and give us 5 objectives. So you have to be able to, label what level you think you're writing at, and I'll be going through them at this draft and deciding whether that's appropriate or not. All right, so next class, we are talking about test blueprints. Sort of alluded to that during this presentation. We're going to be talking more about how you administer tests and what in the world a table of specification is. So I hope that is going to be helpful to you in general in the long run. So please read Chapter 6. Your draft for your TPD is due June 4th, but I figure it's better to give you time to work on this and revise it than to leave it to the last minute. I would say to not start this until you've done the first attempt in the discussion board and gotten feedback on it, so you don't continue to do something incorrectly, right? Please do not forget to fill out your teaching groups, to sign up for a teaching group. Sorry. I realized I went through this in completely the wrong order. But the Turnitin and Qualtrics link, I have had problems sometimes with Turnitin. Qualtrics has never let me down for assignment upload. So I ask students to upload both ways so that we're covered. So I can have a timestamp that you actually submitted something when you said you submitted it, so it's not late. Because even though the drafts are completion grades, if you're late, then I have to take off points. So, that due date becomes kind of important. So, or the time you submitted becomes more important at that point. So, please do submit to both. That's pretty easily understandable in the project. It's TPD, and then you'll see draft 1 has a folder, and in draft 1 you'll see that there's the Turnitin link, and then there's also the Qualtrics link. And so if you'll just submit the assignment using the Word document that's listed there, that would be just fine. All right, so I'll see you all next week.